The silence didn't just break, it detonated. And suddenly, the one man who was never supposed to speak is no longer protecting the version of the story the world was carefully fed.
She married for money. It's very clear she bagged the elephant. She was thrilled. She became a, quote, princess.
Well, you can...
Prince Harry on her... What was it called? Like a mood board.
Mood board.
Do you know?
Board. And then the moment something goes wrong, she blames probably somebody and chucks them out and gets a new person. And so it goes on.
Going to be, my understanding is, reading between the lines, that this is just another attempt.
Meghan Markle's previous conquests. Now, I have to be very clear, this claim...
Apparently we've bought or moved house maybe 10, 12 times. We've apparently divorced maybe 10, 12 times.
Meghan Markle's ex-husband Trevor Engelson is expecting his first child. The director and producer announced on Instagram.
The Queen about having a half-in, half-out type of relationship. She said no to that. However, this recent trip to a...
We're senior working royals that no longer work as members of the royal family. The film is being described...
Because it suits him in terms of his status as a counselor.
Obviously, Trevor Engelson is a very successful TV producer. He now has his own family.
You had the benefit of universally loving and adoring.
No small feat for what she's done. This is clearly somebody that likes to commit to.
He takes care of what could have been an extremely problematic scenario for Meghan, allegedly, but it's
from Trevor Engelson, because of course he's always been very dignified, but via his friends and of course Bethany Frankel.
To get married, he told me that he really wanted children, but you know, the time hasn't come yet, but he really wants to.
Have an idea of how uninterested these real Hollywood types are in Harry and Meghan, in their products.
Damage her reputation even more. But there's others as well. There's another person too that has...
Something shifted, not slowly, not subtly. It cracked open like pressure behind glass that had been building for years, maybe a decade, maybe longer. Because this was never just about a past relationship, it was about a version of reality that only worked as long as one person stayed quiet. And that person, he didn't just stay quiet, he disappeared. He rebuilt. He erased himself from the narrative without protest. Until now. Trevor Engelson, the name that was edited out, softened, minimized, almost erased entirely from the fairy tale that followed. But here's the uncomfortable detail nobody can spin away. He was there before everything. Before the titles, before the transformation, before the carefully polished public identity took over. He didn't just witness the early version, he lived inside it. And now the whispers aren't whispers anymore. They're sharpening into something heavier. Because when someone who has nothing to gain suddenly decides to speak, it doesn't feel like revenge, it feels like a correction. Think about it. For years, the official narrative moved forward untouched. Interviews, documentaries, global sympathy, a story that framed everything in a very specific way. And for that story to work, certain chapters had to stay buried. Certain people had to stay invisible. Trevor was one of them. But invisibility has an expiration date when memory doesn't match mythology. He didn't rush to expose anything. That's what makes this uncomfortable. He didn't sell interviews. He didn't leak pieces to tabloids. He didn't even hint. He just watched. Quietly, patiently, as the version of events he lived through was slowly rewritten in front of millions. And somewhere along the way, silence stopped looking like dignity and started looking like surrender. Because what happens when the man who knew the beginning decides the ending being told is wrong? The timeline suddenly matters. Every detail becomes sharper. Every decision feels different when you rewind with context instead of narrative. Back then, he wasn't just background noise. He was central. He was involved in the climb, the struggle, the doors opening. The kind of support that doesn't get headlines but builds careers. And then something changed. Not overnight, but enough that those who watched it happen still describe it like a shift in temperature. Something turning cold, distant, calculated. The distance between Toronto and Los Angeles wasn't just geography anymore. It became something else entirely. And then came the moment that still doesn't sit right. No conversation, no warning, no unraveling of a relationship in the way people expect, just a package. Delivered. Rings returned like items no longer needed. A clean, almost almost clinical exit. And just like that, years of shared life were reduced to silence. That wasn't just an ending, that was a signal. And for 10 years, he carried it without response. He moved forward, built a life, built stability, built something that didn't require revisiting the past. And for a long time, that looked like closure, until the past started rewriting itself. Because here's where things become impossible to ignore. The public story that followed didn't just move on, it reshaped everything that came before it. The foundation years softened, the support unmentioned, the timeline adjusted, and Trevor wasn't just absent, he was erased. That's not something people react to immediately. That's something that builds, quietly, internally, until one day it stops feeling like patience and starts feeling like being written out of your own history. And that's when the danger begins. Because now, the stakes aren't emotional, they're narrative. The version of events the world believes depends entirely on the people who lived it staying silent. The moment one of them decides not to, the entire structure shakes. And suddenly, 2026 doesn't look random. It looks inevitable. Because timing matters. And insiders are pointing to something very specific. The moment the silence broke wasn't impulsive. It was triggered. Triggered by years of watching a story evolve into something that no longer resembled what he remembers. And that changes everything. Because now it's not about bitterness, it's about contradiction. And contradictions are dangerous when they come from someone who was actually there. The question isn't why he's speaking now. The real question is, what took this long? Because people don't hold on to something like this for a decade unless they believe staying silent is the better choice. And when that choice flips, when speaking suddenly feels more necessary than protecting the past, it means something bigger is at play, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. And now, for the first time, there's a possibility that the untold version, the unpolished version, the version without media framing or strategic storytelling, might finally surface. And if that happens, it doesn't just add another perspective. It forces a comparison between what was lived and what was told, between reality and narrative. And once people start asking those questions, once they start noticing the gaps, the inconsistencies, the details that never quite lined up, that's when everything begins to unravel. Because stories can be controlled, but witnesses, not forever. And just when it seemed like the story couldn't get any more volatile, the pressure didn't ease, it multiplied because the moment whispers of a memoir began circulating. Everything inside those guarded walls reportedly shifted from controlled calm to something far more frantic, far more revealing. The outside world saw nothing, no denial, no carefully crafted statement, no calm dismissal, just silence. But silence in moments like this doesn't always mean confidence. Sometimes it means containment, because according to those who claim to have seen behind that silence, what unfolded privately wasn't calm at all. It was chaos trying to stay hidden. And chaos has a pattern. It doesn't just appear. It leaks through behavior, through reactions that don't match the narrative being presented. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When something isn't real, when something is fabricated or exaggerated, the response is usually simple, controlled, measured. But when something threatens to expose something deeper, something that can't be easily dismissed, the reaction becomes emotional, urgent, desperate, and that's exactly what insiders are describing. A sudden shift, a tightening grip, a level of panic that doesn't align with someone confident in their version of events. Because if the claims were empty, if the whispers were baseless, there would be no need for this level of internal reaction. No need for late-night legal scrambling. No need for the kind of behavior that suggests something far more fragile is at risk. And then there's the pattern that keeps resurfacing, people leaving. Not one or two, but a steady stream. High-ranking staff, trusted insiders, individuals who were close enough to see beyond the surface. 18 departures. 18. That's not coincidence. That's a signal. Because people don't walk away from power, proximity, and influence without reason. They leave when something no longer feels stable, when the environment becomes unpredictable, when the version being presented publicly doesn't match what they're experiencing privately. And that's where the narrative begins to fracture. Because the image being projected has always been one of control, precision, a carefully managed identity. But control requires consistency. And consistency is exactly what starts slipping when too many people walk away with their own unspoken versions of the truth. Then comes the part that pushes this from gossip into something far more explosive. The speculation, the one area that has lived on the edge of public conversation for years, never fully addressed, never fully dismissed. The kind of topic that sits in the shadows because it's too sensitive, too complicated, too dangerous to confront directly. directly. And suddenly, it's no longer just speculation, because the difference now isn't the rumor, it's the source that might confirm or dismantle it. Because every theory that has circulated so far has come from the outside. Observers, analysts, people connecting dots without access to the full picture. But Trevor? He isn't outside. He was there. He existed within the timeline that people are now questioning. And that changes the weight of everything. Because if someone with direct knowledge steps forward, it doesn't just add another voice. It changes the category entirely. It turns theory into something verifiable, or it destroys it completely. Either way, the result is irreversible. And that's why this moment feels different. Because this isn't about random speculation anymore. It's about the possibility of first-hand clarity entering a space that has thrived on ambiguity. And then there's the brand, the carefully constructed next chapter that was supposed to redefine everything. The pivot, the reinvention, the attempt to move away from controversy and into something aspirational, something controlled, something that couldn't be questioned. But it didn't land the way it was supposed to. The response wasn't admiration, it was skepticism, mockery, questions about authenticity, questions about originality, questions about whether the image being sold matched reality at all. And instead of recalibrating, instead of stepping back and reassessing, the reaction reportedly followed a familiar pattern, identifying an external enemy. Because when things don't work, when public reception doesn't align with expectations, it becomes easier to blame sabotage than to question strategy, easier to construct opposition than to confront miscalculation. But narratives have limits, and in 2026, that limit is being tested because the public is no longer reacting the same way. The sympathy isn't automatic, the acceptance isn't guaranteed, and when the same explanation is used repeatedly, it starts losing its impact. Then comes the moment that reveals even more. The visit, the opportunity that could have shifted everything, a chance to reconnect, to reset, to rebuild something that had clearly fractured. And the response? Distance, cold, precise. Not now, maybe not ever. That kind of rejection doesn't just stay external. It seeps inward. It forces questions. It forces reflection. And according to those watching closely, it didn't land quietly. Because when everything begins to stack, the external pressure, the internal tension, the resurfacing of the past, the instability in the present, something eventually gives. And now, even the dynamic that once seemed unbreakable is showing cracks. Not loud ones, not public ones, but visible enough. Separate appearances, different paths, a shift from unity to something more distant, more strategic, more independent. Because when pressure builds, people respond differently. Some push forward, some pull away. And when those responses don't align, the gap between them becomes impossible to ignore. And here's where it all converges. Because this was never just about one man speaking. It was about what he represents. A piece of the past that refused to disappear. A version of events that didn't align with what the world was told. A reminder that not every chapter can be rewritten without consequence. And now, the one factor that makes all of this truly uncontrollable has entered the equation. No agreements, no restrictions, no legal barriers, nothing stopping him. That's the part that changes everything. Because in a world where silence is often secured, controlled, negotiated, this silence wasn't. It was voluntary. And voluntary silence can end at any moment, which means whatever comes next can't be contained. And as the support system that once shielded everything quietly steps back, as the allies who once amplified the narrative grow noticeably silent, the reality becomes harder to ignore. Because in Hollywood, in media, in power circles, there's one rule that overrides everything else. Association depends on value. And when the value shifts from beneficial to risky, distance follows. Quietly, strategically, permanently. And that's exactly what's happening. Because now the question isn't whether the story holds, it's how many people are still holding pieces of a version that hasn't been told yet. Because Trevor might be the first to break the silence, but he might not be the last. And that's where the tension lingers. Because this isn't a finished story. It's not even fully exposed yet. It's in that dangerous middle phase where cracks are visible, pressure is rising, and the truth, whatever it is getting closer to the surface. And once it reaches that point, once it fully breaks through, there's no rewriting it. There's no controlling it. There's only what comes out and what it changes forever.